A standard software as a service liability cap set at 12 months of fees covers under 3% of a typical 2025 breach's $4.5 million average cost. Average data breach costs exceeded $4.5 million in 2025 across widely cited industry benchmarks, while a mid-market software contract's annual fees frequently fall in the range of $100,000. Enterprise legal teams reviewing a startup's standard order form in 2026 are no longer accepting the vendor's default liability cap without a specific carve-out for data breach, confidentiality, and intellectual property indemnification claims. And a startup moving from small business customers to enterprise accounts needs a contracting playbook built around that reality rather than a template inherited from its earliest and least demanding customers. The shift shows up most directly in how enterprise buyers now treat artificial intelligence features embedded inside a software product. 2 years ago, a vendor's use of a large language model as a back-end component rarely appeared in contract negotiations at all. In 2026, enterprise data processing addenda routinely require a vendor to disclose every subprocessor that touches customer data, and a large language model provider integrated into a product's backend now counts as a disclosable subprocessor under that standard, triggering its own flow-down data processing terms. Enterprise buyers increasingly demand contract language, stating explicitly that customer data will not be used to train or fine-tune any underlying model apps. An affirmative, specific, opt-in consent, a standard considerably stricter than the opt-out defaults many startups built into their original terms of service when the product first launched. Service organization control audits have absorbed a parallel expansion. The American Institute of Certified Public Accountants updated its trust services criteria to address AI-driven systems, and enterprise buyers conducting vendor security reviews in 2026 now expect a SOC 2 Type 2 report to document model lineage, maintain inference logs with personally identifiable information properly redacted, demonstrate drift monitoring evidence showing the model's outputs remain within expected bounds over time, and include a third-party risk assessment covering any large language model vendor the company relies on. A startup that completed its first SOC 2 audit in 2023 or 2024, before these AI-specific criteria existed, needs a materially expanded audit scope for 2026 renewal, and counsel advising on enterprise sales cycles should flag this gap early, because a stale SOC 2 report is now a common reason enterprise security review committees delay or reject a vendor regardless of how strong the underlying product is. The commercial mechanics of contract timing deserve equal attention alongside these substantive terms. Startups that begin enterprise renewal negotiations roughly 6 months before contract expiration report cost outcomes measurably better than startups that wait until 30 days before expiration to start talking, because the compressed timeline of a last-minute renewal removes the customer's ability to credibly threaten to walk, which is the primary source of negotiating power in a renewal discussion. A vendor's sales and legal teams that treat contract renewal as a calendar reminder rather than a structured negotiation lose negotiating power before the conversation even starts, and the available data suggests that loss is not marginal. Limitation of liability and indemnification provisions remain the two most heavily negotiated clauses in enterprise software agreements, but a third category, rights to AI-generated or AI-assisted outputs, has moved into that same top tier of negotiation intensity in 2026 specifically because vendor templates now embed generative features by default rather than as an add-on module. An enterprise customer using a vendor's AI-assisted document generation feature wants clarity on who owns the generated output, whether the vendor can use that output to improve its own model, and what happens to previously generated outputs if the customer terminates the relationship. Startups that have not updated their standard terms to address these questions directly are negotiating each enterprise deal from scratch, spending legal hours on issues that a properly drafted template would resolve before the conversation starts. The unexpected implication for a startup's internal operations is that enterprise contracting readiness is now substantially a product and engineering question, not solely a legal one. A SOC 2 audit that must document model lineage and inference logging requires the engineering team to build that logging and retention infrastructure well before the audit begins, not in response to a specific enterprise prospect's request during a live sales cycle. Startups that treat SOC2 and enterprise contracting readiness as a legal department deliverable, disconnected from engineering roadmap planning, consistently discover the gap only when a large deal stalls in security review, at which point the fix requires months of engineering work the sales team did not budget time for. Founders and general counsel building an enterprise contracting playbook for 2026 should start from 3 specific documents rather than the generic master services agreement template. A data processing addendum that names every subprocessor, including any embedded large language model. A limitation of liability structure that carves data breach and intellectual property indemnification claims out of the general fee-based cap. And the SOC2 Type 2 report scoped to the AICPA's updated criteria for AI-driven systems. A startup that walks into its first enterprise security review with all 3 already in hand converts what is otherwise a multi-month due diligence bottleneck into a matter of days. And the deals that stall in 2026 are overwhelmingly the ones where the vendor is building these documents reactively, one enterprise prospect at a time, instead of once, correctly, in advance. Uptime service level agreements have quietly become as commercially significant as the liability and indemnification terms that draw most of the negotiating attention, particularly for startups whose product sits in an enterprise customer's critical operational path. A service level agreement promising 99.9% monthly uptime sounds reassuring until translated into actual permitted downtime, which works out to roughly 43 minutes per month. And enterprise customers running mission-critical workflows through a vendor's platform increasingly negotiate service credits, termination rights, and root cause disclosure obligations tied to specific outage thresholds rather than accepting a vendor's generic uptime commitment at face value. A startup's engineering and legal teams need to agree, before any enterprise deal reaches the negotiation table, on what uptime commitment the infrastructure can actually support and document. Because promising a service level the platform cannot reliably meet creates a contractual default risk that compounds every subsequent renewal conversation. Data residency and cross-border transfer terms have moved from a niche requirement affecting only regulated industries to a standard enterprise procurement question across nearly every sector by 2026. An enterprise customer operating in the European Union or simply serving European customers itself wants contractual assurance that its data processed through a vendor's platform remains within specific geographic boundaries, or at minimum that any cross-border transfer relies on a currently valid legal transfer mechanism under applicable data protection law. Startups that built their infrastructure on a single region cloud deployment without considering data residency requirements from the outset face a difficult and expensive retrofit. Once an enterprise prospect makes regional data residency a contractual condition of closing, and the infrastructure change required to satisfy that condition typically takes considerably longer than the sales cycle waiting on it. Termination rights and data portability provisions round out the set of terms enterprise buyers scrutinize most closely, and for good reason grounded in real market experience. An enterprise customer moving a meaningful volume of its own operational data into a startup's platform wants contractual certainty about what happens to that data if the relationship ends, whether through the customer's own decision to switch vendors or through the startup's business failure. Provisions specifying a defined data export format, a fixed transition assistance period following termination, and an express commitment to data deletion following that period address the enterprise buyer's legitimate concern about vendor lock-in and vendor viability risk simultaneously. A startup without clear answers to these questions in its standard contract forces every enterprise prospect's procurement team to negotiate the answer from scratch, which lengthens the sales cycle and signals to a sophisticated buyer that the vendor has not thought carefully about its own customer's operational risk. Pricing and payment term negotiations in the enterprise segment differ meaningfully from the self-service and small business motion most startups start with. And general counsel supporting a sales team's first enterprise deals should expect this friction rather than treating it as a signal something has gone wrong. Enterprise finance departments typically require annual invoicing rather than monthly credit card billing, extended payment terms running 60 to 90 days rather than the immediate payment common in smaller deals, and in many cases a most favored customer or most favored pricing provision guaranteeing the enterprise buyer will not pay more than any similarly situated customer for the same product. A startup's finance team needs to understand these terms are now standard enterprise procurement practice, not aggressive customer demands to resist reflexively, and a legal team that pushes back on every one of these requests as though it were unusual signals and experience with enterprise sales cycles in a way that itself becomes a negotiating disadvantage. The compounding lesson across liability caps, SOC2 scope, uptime commitments, data residency, termination rights, and payment terms is that enterprise contracting readiness is not a single document a startup produces once and reuses indefinitely. It is an operating capability that has to evolve alongside the product, the infrastructure, and the regulatory environment the customer base operates within, reviewed on a fixed schedule rather than only when a specific deal forces the question. A related point that in-house counsel handling enterprise SaaS negotiations across a range of transactions in 2025 and 2026 have raised repeatedly deserves direct mention. The indemnification cap negotiation rarely turns on the number itself. It turns on whether the carve-outs are drafted precisely enough that both sides can predict, before a dispute ever arises, exactly which categories of harm fall inside the cap and which fall outside it. Vague carve-out language that references data breach generally, without defining what triggers it, produces exactly the kind of ambiguity that turns a contract dispute into protracted litigation over interpretation rather than a clean application of agreed terms. Interested in analysis about the intersection of corporate law, securities regulation, tech, artificial intelligence, public policy, and the law? Check out my Substack channel, https://theinnovationattorney.substack.com.